Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vraks. Last time, the Death Korps finally got the breakthrough they had been looking for so very, very long, and in the most unexpected of places as well. What was intended as a mere diversionary attack for a larger offensive operation turned into a massive breakthrough when the brave soldiers of the 9th Company of the 261st Regiment broke through the stronghold of Fort A453. The unexpected breakthrough caught the Krieg commanders almost as off guard as it did the Vraksians, but thanks to the quick thinking and reaction of General Duzhin, 3 companies of the 61st Tank Regiment were sent into combat to secure the breakthrough. And after 3 days, as the battered and bloodied survivors of the 9th Company finally emerged from Fort A453, it had been fully secured by the God Emperor's loyal Death Korps. And with the door now well and truly open, the 8th Assault Corps, which up until this point had been held in reserve, would soon begin flowing through the breach. This would have dire consequences for the 1st Vraksian defensive line. The previously so solid defenses would now be under attack from the flanks and the rear simultaneously. The defenders would have to act quickly, otherwise the Death Korps would simply just roll up the entirety of their defensive line and all of its defenders. Faced with this danger, there was really only 2 things the defenders could possibly do. One was a large-scale counterattack to try and reclaim Fort A453. This had already been attempted during the 3-day struggle for the fort. But with the arrival of the lead elements of the 61st Tank Regiment and the 8th Assault Corps coming swiftly behind it, this was impractical. And since simply standing and fighting would be little more than suicide, that option was not even considered, leaving only the last resort: a full-scale general withdrawal of all combat personnel from the first line towards the second. This maneuver would hopefully result in most of the first line's troops being able to withdraw behind fresh defenses, where they could then be reorganized and used to bolster the second defensive line. As a part of this general withdrawal, a portion of the second defensive line would also be surrendered. That is the portion that sticks out heading towards the north and facing towards the west. Normally, this portion of the line was intended to force the enemy to attack primarily from the west and, in conjunction with the northernmost 1st defensive line, limit the amount of area an enemy could attack, but the Death Korps had shown that they had plenty of numbers to wrap all the way around the Vraksian defenses to the north and west. Thusly, with the puncture of the 1st defensive line, the northern defenses would also swiftly be rendered untenable, and along with them, this spar of the second line. It would swiftly be exposed to attacks from the flank and the rear, and be rolled up just like the first line was. And as a final part of the withdrawal, a new defensive line would be organized as a part of the second line. This would be in defense of the Thracian Primaris starport to the east, and, well, it wouldn't be so much a defensive line all in all, as improvised positions defending the 2 primary bridges leading to the starport. Which might at first sound rather flimsy, but these bridges were several kilometers long, and would offer literally nothing in the way of cover or concealment for any troops attempting to cross them. Even just a bunch of makeshift defenses and improvised positions manned by a handful of defenders would be more than enough to make these bridges virtually unassailable. And that is of course before we get to the question of whether or not the Vraksians had rigged the bridges for demolition. Of course, they couldn't leave them completely undefended, just in case the Death Korps of Krieg were particularly insane. They had, after all, showed a bit of a history of lunacy so far. However, as previously mentioned, the Death Korps, whilst being entirely fine with sacrifice, are still not overly fond of pointless sacrifice, and trying to storm these bridges would, in all due likelihood, be nothing but. Hell, even if they did manage to take them, unlikely as it was, and even if the defenders did not decide to blow them up, the bridges would in all due likelihood be so damaged by the battle that they would be virtually worthless to the Death Korps without years of engineering work. Now then, the Vraksian plan was fairly simple, if rather drastic. It would surrender considerable quantities of territory to the advancing Death Korps, and it would also bring several important hab blocks well and truly within range of the Imperium's artillery. It would, however, allow them to fortify and consolidate their positions, and most importantly, it would save hundreds of thousands of Vraksian troops that would otherwise be outflanked, surrounded, and annihilated. Considering the circumstances, a general withdrawal appeared to be the only real choice. That, however, did of course not make it easy. For, whilst in theory it might sound simple enough to move one's troops backwards to new positions, nothing could be further from the truth. The execution of a large-scale general withdrawal is quite possibly the single most difficult maneuver a general could ever be asked to oversee. The logistics alone would be an organizational nightmare of the highest order, as hundreds of thousands of men, along with their equipment, their guns, their vehicles, their food, and various other supplies will all have to be moved in the same direction in an organized fashion. Merely just ensuring that all of the various groups of soldiers don't constantly get in one another's way is a titanic task, not to mention the simple fact that any such large-scale movement of men and vehicles will invariably turn even the best paths into oceans of mud. And after 6 months of heavy bombardment, the paths leading back from the first line were, well, not in the best of states, shall we say. And to make matters considerably worse, there was also the nature of Vraks itself to consider. As mentioned in a previous video, Vraks is essentially a dead rock. The only real form of life on the planet that isn't imperial or traitor is algae that exists out in the larger bodies of water. On the battlefield area, however, there is essentially nothing in the way of vegetation, which means there are no roots to keep the ground together. The ground then is extremely porous, and the planet also is tormented by sudden torrential downpours, which turns the already terrible terrain into what can only really be described as a liquid ocean of shit. Of course, there were some other ways back, through communications trenches or underground tunnels, but these were meant to convey relatively small numbers of reinforcements into an ongoing battle. There was simply no way in hell they would be able to accommodate this large a movement of troops. Best case scenario, some of the more valuable men and equipment could be transported through these underground tunnels, but all in all it would make up a mere percentage of the total numbers that needed moving. So the vast majority of Vraks' defenders were stuck slugging it back across the shell-cratered mud hellhole between the first and second line. In such an ocean of mud, trucks will constantly get stuck. Artillery pieces will start sinking in if left stationary but for a moment, and the poor foot sloggers will be exhausted by the march through ankle-deep sucking mud and demoralized by their retreat. And what else? Oh, I seem to be forgetting something. Oh, yes, of course. Then there's the small matter of the 88th Siege Army. The act of withdrawing in and of itself is hard enough, but doing so in the face of a determined enemy is a whole nother matter, and when it comes to determination, there are very few armies out there in the galaxy that can match the Death Korps of Krieg. And even more so now that the General Staff had awoken from their lengthy slumber. Żółka had issued orders stating that all 4 Line Korps should initiate immediate offensive operations along the entirety of their frontage, with the goal of preventing the enemy's withdrawal and overrunning their rear units. Subsequently, the offensive should be carried forwards with all possible haste into the enemy's secondary line, which should itself be assaulted and breached immediately so as to make up for lost time. The order also made it quite clear that any commanders found shirking their duty by lingering too long in their prepared positions would face the full force of Imperial military justice. In other words, the order, in all due essentiality, was an instruction to run screaming towards the enemy with all possible alacrity, without even the pretense of care, planning, or contingencies, and anyone found to be unwilling to do so would simply just be shot. Of course, there is something to be said for ensuring that your men are more afraid of their commanders than the enemy, but this plan was probably on the wrong side of bold, edging dangerously close to careless. But fortunately, as High Command in their infinite wisdom had already determined, the enemy was simply incapable of launching a large-scale offensive. There was, of course, that one mechanized attack they carried out during the battle over the first defensive line 6 or so months ago, but that was, of course, as we have already determined, a fluke, and could not possibly happen again. Therefore, the general offensive was a bold and aggressive maneuver, and not at all a foolhardy one. And to make that absolutely clear, there was even a plan. Of sorts, anyways. The 34th Line Corps would simply advance towards the second line of defenses. Their easternmost flank would be covered by the massive gorge that split the plains of Saramita. Their western flank would be covered by the southern elements of the 12th Line Corps, which would also move up into contact with the 2nd defensive line. Meanwhile, the northern elements of the 12th Line Corps, along with the 11th Assault Corps, would move northwards, with the aim of cutting off the Vraksians' retreat from the first line towards the second. And whilst the 11th Assault Corps made its move, the 1st and 30th Line Corps would apply pressure to the enemy's lines to make it as difficult as possible for them to withdraw. As far as plans go, this one was possibly even more basic than the first plan, and the first plan was essentially surround then assault the enemy, but in all due honesty, if they could pull it off, it wasn't a bad plan, it was just lacking in contingencies, shall we say. Nevertheless, it started out pretty well. After the fall of Fort A453, 1st Line Corps and 30th Line Corps, which had been attacking all the way along the front line to draw reinforcements away from the crucial breakthrough, had undergone a period of rest. And now that they were ready to attack again, they did so with increased vigor, fully aware of Żółka's plans to overrun the enemy and head towards the second line. To achieve this goal, it was imperative that the 1st and 30th Corps break through the outer lines quickly, and so they threw everything they had into this offensive, and ran into absolutely nothing. The defensive lines in front of them appeared to be essentially completely abandoned. Of course, there was the occasional heavy machine gun position that was still manned, the occasional sniper and a handful of platoons held back to guard the rear, but by and large the outer defenses had been completely surrendered by the Vraksian defenders. This might initially sound like rather good news, and I'm sure for the poor bastards who were not getting shot at, it was pretty much just that, but For the commanders, this was possibly the worst possible news they could have received, since it meant that the enemy apparently had already escaped, which meant that all of the blood and toil spent to attack this outer line was, well, not for naught, but compared to the possibility of destroying a large quantity of enemy troops, this was a pretty major setback. The 1st and 30th didn't have all that much in the ways of mobile forces. They were supposed to tie up the defenders so that the 11th could sweep around behind them and cut them off. Now they sent what they had in the way of mobile forces, mostly elements of the 8th Assault Corps, towards the Vraksian starport to the east. This was honestly mostly a desperation maneuver. They still didn't really expect being able to take the starport, but you never know. Maybe the enemy had overreacted. Maybe they had weakened the defenses around the starport too much, and maybe they could be caught by surprise by a rapid armored thrust. And it was also possible that the outermost defensive line to the east hadn't been fully evacuated yet. It was therefore possible that maybe portions of the 8th Assault Corps could achieve what the 11th was supposed to do to the north. In a smaller scale, granted, but anything would be better than allowing the enemy to withdraw completely unmauled. And hell, even in the worst case scenario where the enemy was able to withdraw entirely unmolested, it would place the 1st Corps between the central citadel of Vraks and the starports, leaving the remainder of the Vraksian defenders entirely surrounded, either within the citadel or in the starport. It would also prevent any future theoretical reinforcement from reaching the defenders. Granted, having to end the offensive with only the meager gains of finally being able to surround the Vraksian defenders and moving on to the second line would be less than ideal, most definitively, but it would at least be something, some measurable gain to show for all of this. And whilst, yes, it would still leave the Death Korps behind schedule, it would not be critically so. Whether or not it would be enough for the commander of the 1st Line Corps to keep his job, or alternatively his life, well, that was the question that had said commander somewhat worried. This was supposed to be a large sweeping advance to catch the Vraksian defenders and overrun the second line, but it would appear that they had escaped, which meant the second line would be even more strongly held than the first. The primary worry now was whether or not it could be breached swiftly. At the end of the first day, the 1st Line Corps had advanced round about half the way towards the second defensive line. Meanwhile, mechanized and armored elements of the 8th Assault Corps, along with infantry formations from the 1st Line Corps, was heading towards Hab Block 1, which lay just right in between the Vraksian starport and the citadel. These elements had been slightly delayed by the order that they should halt well in time before nightfall, so that they could construct at least some provisional defenses. This was in contrast to their order from High Command stating that they should push onwards with all due speed, but the Krieg commander in charge of the 1st Line Corps, like all Krieg commanders, had been around the block once or twice before, and he was not comfortable with ordering his units to advance without at least some basic precautions. High Command be damned. Leading one of the easternmost elements of the advance was Colonel Adal of the 19th Siege Regiment. According to orders, he had stopped well before nightfall and constructed provisional defenses. They weren't much, they were mostly consisting of simple trench lines and a handful of dugouts for command personnel, but still, it was a hell of a lot better than nothing, and in time before nightfall, his own command dugout was prepared. A little bit out into the night, the colonel was awoken by one of his aides, informing him that they were receiving reports from the outlying sentries. The reports indicated that they were hearing motorized activity outside of the perimeter. This was most unusual. The 19th Siege Regiment should be at the leading edge of the advance, and the order to dig in for the night had been issued to all Krieg forces. There shouldn't be anything moving out beyond the 19th Regiment's perimeter, and yet his sentries were reporting otherwise. If these were any other troops, you might think that the months and months of waiting might have got to them. Now that they'd finally gotten into combat, they would be leaping at shadows, seeing ghosts and mechanized columns everywhere, but these were Krieg's guardsmen, and even more so, these were Krieg's sentries. They had seen pretty much everything the galaxy was able to throw at them, and the Colonel was confident that if they said they were hearing motorized movement, there was something out there, moving about, and if it was outside of their perimeter, it wasn't from Krieg. That, you might think, should have made the answer to who it was rather obvious, but the Colonel, along with all other Krieg officers, had received briefings from the Imperial General Staff under Commander Julka, insisting that the enemy had no capacity for large-scale movement of troops. Something the Colonel himself was somewhat questioning, after seeing the first defensive line having been abandoned en masse, but still, he was a Krieg officer, and Krieg officers follow their superiors' instructions, in the faith that their commanders must know something that they are not privy to. The only logical conclusion then, once again resting upon the assumption that the enemy was not able to move a large number of troops in an organized, mechanized, and motorized fashion, was that this was one of the localized counterattacks they had been asked to expect. In which case, the 19th Siege Regiment had already prepared themselves as well as they could. Somewhat against orders, they had already prepared defensive positions, and they also had the support of nearby Krieg regiments. This should all be more than enough to see off any small counterattack of regimental size or less. The reports of movement outside of the perimeter continued for the rest of the night, but no attack materialized until the next day, when first ranging shots began falling upon the 19th Siege Regiment, the occasional high-explosive artillery round here and there, which quickly grew into an absolute deluge of artillery fire, which continued to grow in intensity and frequency until the point where you could not distinguish one explosion from another, and the barrage was simply heard as a constant deafening roar across the entirety of the 19th Regiment's positions. Colonel Adal in his dugout was already starting to think that this seemed hefty for a regimental-sized attack, but he reasoned that they were fairly close to the first outlying hab block, laying on the road to the Vraksian starport. It was entirely possible that the traitors had considerable artillery assets dug in, around, and inside the hab block, which could potentially explain this overabundance of enemy shelling. For the moment, the response would be to direct the guns of the 19th Siege Regiment to open up counter-battery fire, and also request further heavy artillery support from the surrounding Krieg regiments. If this was to devolve into a lengthy artillery duel, he was confident that the Krieg guns would eventually come out on top. Whether or not it would be in time to save his regiment, well, that, in all due honesty, was immaterial. However, the barrage eventually started lessening, and instead of further high-explosive shells, smoke grenades now began landing upon his positions. This was a clear sign that the enemy had more than just artillery in store for him and his men, and sure enough, enemy forces were soon spotted moving out of the smoke. What followed was intense fighting all along the 19th Regiment's frontage. The colonel in his command dugout was struggling to piece together what exactly was happening. Due to the intensity of the bombardment, entire sections of his regiment had simply ceased to exist. Now they were under attack by an unknown number of enemies, attacking what appeared to be the entire frontage of the regiment. and as the day proceeded, the pace of the battle continued to escalate. Reports were streaming into regimental headquarters about huge numbers of enemy troops streaming into the outer trenches. These massed human wave-style assaults were spearheaded by massive semi-armored beasts wielding an assortment of improvised melee weaponry. These monstrosities were later positively identified as Oghren members of the planet's Labour Auxilia, being deployed here by the Vraksians as de facto shock troopers, using their strength, drug-fueled ferocity, and sheer bulk to break open the Krieg trench lines. This proved a improvised but effective strategy, as nearing midday the situation was confused. The regiment front lines had been broken in multiple places, with secondary and tertiary trenches reporting ongoing combat with enemy troops, and also now reports were beginning to come in detailing the movements of enemy armor within the regiment's positions. At least one super heavy had been identified, and several antiquated yet still effective heavy tanks, along with Chimera APCs and Lehman Russ battle tanks, providing direct point-blank fire support to the Vraksian infantry. No matter how you viewed it, this was undoubtedly looking less and less like a localized counterattack by the minute. Recognizing this, regimental headquarters authorized and requested heavy artillery support to be deployed inside of the regiment's perimeter. The situation was so confused, it would be impossible to be sure not to strike friendly troops locked in combat with the enemy, but the situation was so critical, the tide of enemy troops had to be stopped, regardless of the costs. Simultaneously with this decision, requests for further instructions and aid were sent over the Vox to Corps headquarters, but command insisted that it could not possibly be a concerted effort by the Vraksians to assault the Corps' left flank. The 19th was ordered to hold and repel the small enemy force they were faced with, and then subsequently launch a counterattack towards Hab Block 1. All things being equal, this was far from the most reasonable order Colonel Adal had ever received, but he was an officer of the Death Korps of Krieg, and so no subsequent requests for instructions were sent from the 19th Siege Regiment to Corps headquarters. The battle continued to rage with undiminished intensity for the remainder of the day, until finally night time arrived and forced both parties to separate. With the arrival of this greatly welcome pause, the colonel and his command staff set about the considerable task of figuring out how much of the 19th Regiment was still in existence. Almost all of the Vox cables laid out by the regiment during the previous night had been severed, reducing communication to short-range Vox speeds and the occasional intact Voxcaster belonging to some battalion or platoon command squad. Runners were also used frequently during the night to organize the often shattered elements of larger formations into ad hoc combat groups. It was also, of course, necessary to not only find out where one's friends are, but where the enemy was located as well. So throughout the night, the more intact formations sent out combat probes to locate the Vraksians. And by the very same coin, the Vraksians also sent out their own patrols to locate Krieg soldiers. This left the night filled with sporadic bursts of firing and the occasional drumfire barrage of artillery, annihilating an identified position here and there. But for the most part, neither side was particularly inclined to make anything major out of the nighttime skirmishes, contenting themselves with reorganizing what they could and preparing for the next day's battle. And clearly the traitors were rather impatient, as the moment that dawn broke again on the second day, they resumed their attacks against the 19th Siege Regiment. At this point, the colonel was already aware that he was being pushed to the absolute limit. Any ideas of a counterattack were, on hold for the time being, let's say, as the colonel himself left his command dugout to join the trench lines and fight against the enemy, lasgun in hand. The enemy's initial assault was seen off with heavy losses, and a second assault was also seen off, but during that assault, the enemy had made it into the final Krieg trench line, meaning that when the third assault hit, the colonel and his remaining men, reduced now to some 80-odd soldiers in his immediate vicinity, would be attacked from the front, the left, and the right. The position was clearly untenable. The final order was issued that as many of the wounded survivors of the 19th Regiment as possible should be withdrawn from the various positions that they still held. Meanwhile, the colonel himself would take half of his remaining forces and fight a rearguard action, while the other half would try their damnedest to escape and bring the message back to Corps headquarters that the 19th Siege Regiment had essentially ceased to exist as a fighting formation, leaving the 1st Line Corps' left flank completely open. The Cardinal's armed forces had done the precise thing Imperial General Staff had insisted so vehemently was impossible. Ever since the fall of Fort A453, they had been carefully marshalling their mechanized and armed reserves into a massive riposte aimed to disrupt and halt the Imperial offensive they knew must come soon after the fall of A453. And what a disruption it was! Clearly, the Cardinal's loyal followers included some military men of quality, as in all due respects, this maneuver was a brilliant one. The Vraksian leadership had recognized that holding the outer line, now that it had been broken, was futile. They also recognized that the Imperium's response to the creation of such a break would be a massive offensive in an attempt to catch the defenders whilst they were withdrawing and reorganizing. Armed with this knowledge, they came up with a bold and brilliant plan that made use of the circumstances to their full extent, creating not only an expertly concealed dagger, but also an unbreakable shield in the process. As they had already realized that holding onto the outer line was pointless, they immediately issued orders for it to be abandoned en masse as soon as practically possible, whilst also taking into consideration the need for subterfuge. Men and material would primarily be moved under the cover of darkness, with the exception of those who could be moved by covered means, such as through tunnels or concealed trenches. This was hands down the most dangerous phase of the operation, as large numbers of marginally trained troops would have to carry out complex maneuvers in darkness with only minimal lighting. The fact that they pulled it off, and without the 88th Siege Army ever realizing it was happening, was an incredible achievement on behalf of the Vraksian General Staff. Not only had they executed one of the most difficult military maneuvers there is, an organized withdrawal in the face of the enemy, they had done so with poorly trained troops, under terrible conditions, and right beneath the noses of the Death Korps of Krieg. It would be impressive enough if their achievements stopped there, but of course, they didn't. After organizing a masterful withdrawal, the Vraksians also extricated the best and most mobile elements of the withdrawing troops and integrated them with the reserves of the second line, creating essentially an assault corps all of their very own, with tanks, super heavies, self-propelled artillery, and mechanized infantry. And once again, the creation and movement of this powerful formation was done in complete secrecy. Now, you might be wondering how such a thing would even be possible. How do you move thousands, tens of thousands, and possibly even hundreds of thousands of men out of prepared positions without being noticed by the enemy? How do you also marshal these troops into a massed formation of mechanized and armored elements? Surely these things make a lot of noise. Surely they kick up a lot of dust, and surely they require a massive logistical system around them. We are, after all, talking about the movements of tens and thousands of men and hundreds of armored vehicles, along with thousands of trucks. And whilst this all is a very difficult task, extraordinarily so, it is not impossible. It merely requires, merely, iron discipline on behalf of the troops and extraordinarily careful coordination and consideration on behalf of the command staff. If you would like a real-life example of this, for example, you should look into the Soviets' maneuvers before the Battle of Kursk, where they maneuvered vast quantities of men and armor into position in front of the then expected German offensive, all without the Germans actually noticing. Of course, the Germans had technology that wasn't quite as advanced as in the 41st millennium, but there are two things here that allowed the Vraksians to do this. The first and most obvious was the lack of Imperial void superiority over the battlefield, with the key phrase there being over the battlefield itself. The Imperium, of course, had complete void superiority in the space surrounding Vraks, but they did not have it directly over the citadel itself. Over the fortifications themselves, and for a considerable area around the fortifications, Imperial warships could not venture for fear of being targeted and destroyed by the massive laser batteries on Vraks. The Imperial Navy could potentially carry out high-speed scouting missions utilizing their smallest and fastest warships to essentially do a run-by of the defensive network, hoping to travel so quickly so as to not be shot down and still gather some intelligence data. But this was only done for the first few weeks of the planetary campaign, when it was feared that the enemy might launch a large-scale attack against the then still deploying Death Korps. Now that the Death Korps was on the ground, it was considered far too risky to risk destroyers or even possibly light cruisers in scouting missions, as even the fastest ship only had a decent chance of making it through without being turned into so much orbital scrap. So that precluded orbital means of gathering intelligence. The next most obvious would be good old-fashioned aircraft, or, well, pseudo-aircraft in this particular regards, since any and all aeronautica forces on the planet would of course be deployed by the Imperial Navy. And in the case of the 88th Siege Army, they had virtually no aeronautica forces whatsoever. There were some attached to them in a secondary manner, as in that they were commanded by the Imperial Navy elements in orbit, but they were not involved in the ground conflict in any way, shape, or form. They had been held back in reserve for the first few weeks for possible deployment on the surface in case the enemy tried a large-scale counterattack, in which case they would zoom down from orbit and attack the enemy's columns. But since this attack never materialized, the aeronautica forces were never deployed, as Vraks itself had no aeronautica forces, not even improvised local air forces. Thusly, it was decided that it would not be necessary to attach any aeronautica forces directly to the 88th Siege Army. As a direct consequence of not having any aircraft whatsoever, the Siege Army of course were not in possession of any spy or spotting aircraft that might have been able to identify this retreat. Though, to be honest, even if they had them, they would be of extremely limited value, as Krieg itself was of course a fortress world, well and truly prepared to defend itself from any sort of attack, including one from the air. It had vast quantities of AAA batteries along every single defensive line, so even if the Imperials were in possession of such crafts, it's far from certain that they would have actually done any particular good. It should also be mentioned, though, and whilst we are not taking anything away from the achievements of the Vraksian command staff, as they achieved considerable things indeed, they were ably helped by a third factor that allowed them to pull all of this off. A factor that they were unaware of, and hell, that the Death Korps itself couldn't really do anything with either. Namely, the fact that the command staff of the Cardinal was being ever so ably helped along by the Imperial General Staff. which continued to insist all the way up to and beyond the point that the Vraksians' mass armoured formations broke through the 19th Regiment, that it was simply impossible for the Vraksians to have done what they had already so clearly achieved. It would almost appear as if situating the army's headquarters and general staff in an entirely different solar system was having some negative effects on the decision-making process, but, of course, suggesting such a thing would be tantamount to doubting the infallibility of High Command, and that simply wasn't done. So instead, Krieg Command, upon hearing about the events transpiring on their extreme left flank, simply sent a report to Lord Julka's office informing him in the most polite terms possible that the impossible had been made possible, and that they were in the process of dealing with the impossible. Unfortunately, that was a lot easier said than done. After 2 days of grueling fighting, the Vraksians had their breakthrough, and with the Imperial High Command somewhat paralyzed by simply not being willing to accept what was happening, there wasn't anything at the ready to plug the gap and prevent the breakthrough either. This meant that the siege army would have to take some rather drastic means of their own. Like the Vraksians had retreated, now it was the Krieg Death Korps' time to retreat. There was no time to create more solid defensive lines, as the enemy had already circumvented and was now about to start rolling up their flank. This could not be allowed to happen, of course, and so the front lines would have to start retreating immediately. But the problem, of course, again, was the enemy was already upon them. At least, the Vraksians had had some time to execute their withdrawal. The Krieg troopers had no such luxury. In which case, there was only one real option. If the enemy was already upon them and they had no time, they would simply have to create some time. And so, the command staff of the 1st Corps ordered elements of the 7th Tank Regiment and the surviving Death Riders of the 19th Company to simply charge the Vraksian armoured spearhead. Additionally, the 261st Regiment, that had previously been on the 19th Regiment's right flank, would now have to turn, dig in, and hopefully buy some more time after the Vraksians had brushed aside the 7th and the remains of the 19th. All of this would then hopefully result in enough time being purchased for the rest of the 1st Corps to withdraw. It's also important to point out that this wasn't just a crisis for the 1st Corps. This was potentially a very, very big deal indeed for the entirety of the Imperial Guard army on Vraks. If the Vraksians managed to overrun the 1st Corps by rolling up its flanks, then inevitably the 30th Line Corps would be next, then the 12th and the 34th. The enemy's counterattack could not be allowed to gain any further momentum or ground. And as a part of this, the other 3 Line Corps had to call off all offensive operations against the 2nd Vraksian defensive line. This was done to ensure that the other 3 Line Corps were able to pull further regiments off the offensive line and into reserve positions, from which they could then potentially be deployed in support of the 1st Corps should they be broken through yet again. In addition to this, the 8th Assault Corps was fully disengaged from the 2nd defensive line and sent northwards to form an offensive reserve behind the 1st Corps in case they needed to launch a counterattack. But of course it would take quite some time for these forces to fully reposition themselves, so for now it was up to the forces of the 7th Tank Regiment, the survivors of the 19th, and the 261st to stem the tide and allow the 1st Corps to relocate itself to a position where it might make use of these reserves. And the first Imperial unit to make contact with the Vraksian spearhead, now storming towards the 1st Corps, was the 15th Tank Company, under the command of Captain Gerson. Gerson was a Vanquisher man, and like all Krieg commanders had risen through the ranks from a lowly loader to now the commander of the 15th Tank Company, and he was still sat in the same Vanquisher in which he had first gained tank command. The Vanquisher is a specialized anti-tank variant upon the standard Leman Russ battle tank that forgoes the usual battle cannon in return for a high-velocity Vanquisher cannon capable of firing specialized sub-caliber anti-tank rounds, able to knock out armored vehicles at ranges that the standard Leman Russ could only dream of. And that was certainly good, because if the captain had any ambitions of surviving this day, he was going to have to squeeze every ounce of anti-tank potential out of his Vanquisher, as he and the other 50-odd Imperial tanks with him had just spotted the lead elements of the enemy's armoured spearhead, and they appeared to number well in excess of 100 tanks. All the signs pointed towards that this was probably going to be a very, very long day, and indeed it was. During the length of it, the captain himself claimed 3 confirmed kills before an enemy shot burst through the front of his own Vanquisher tank, setting it ablaze, forcing the captain and his crew to escape the burning wreck and attempt to command the rest of the battle on foot. And eventually it was becoming clear that as more and more enemy reinforcements arrived, the 15th Company would not be able to hold fixed positions. The captain ordered the remainder of his vehicles to begin pulling back slowly, whilst maintaining fire on the enemy so as to make sure that they couldn't rush them. And in an act of insane bravery, the remaining survivors of the 19th Regiment's Death Riders decided to provide the 15th Company with the cover they required by charging headlong, hunting lances lowered, into the enemy's armoured spearhead. The heroic sacrifice of the 19th Regiment's Death Riders allowed the remnants of the 15th Company to disengage relatively safely, and when night fell on the 3rd day of battle, 9 Leman Russ battle tanks and 2 heavy Macarius tanks was all that remained of the 15th Company. But the 15th Company nevertheless still existed. They had blunted the enemy spearhead and had severely delayed their advance. And in many other areas along the flank, other companies of the 7th Tank Regiment had done the same. And so, by all accounts, despite the heavy casualties, this, the 3rd day of battle and the 1st day of delaying operations, had been a success for the Death Korps of Krieg. It was, however, not done yet, not by a long shot. The 1st Corps was going to require a hell of a lot more than 1 day to complete its withdrawal, and so the battle dragged on for yet another 3 days. Yet further elements of the 7th Tank Regiment were thrown into the fight, alongside other Krieg siege regiments to stem the tide. But day by day, meter by meter, the enemy advance was slowed and eventually checked. Almost a full week after the initial Vraksian attack on the 19th Siege Regiment, the offensive had finally been halted and to some extent reversed. The 1st Line Corps was safe. It was no longer in danger of being overrun by the enemy, and thus, by extension, the entirety of the 88th Siege Army had avoided destruction. At least for now. The problem, of course, was that this had required the relocation of massive numbers of troops, including the vital 8th Assault Corps, to cover the 1st Line Corps, formations that would otherwise have been attacking the 2nd line of Vraksian defenses. And without these troops available to put pressure on the line, the Cardinal's forces that had been retreating from the 1st line were able to complete the final phases of their withdrawal undisturbed. Now, fully reorganized, resupplied and rested, they were free to be deployed to the 2nd line and strengthen it yet further with tens of thousands of men, guns and tanks, leaving the line stronger than it had ever been before. Any hope of a swift breakthrough of the second line was now well and truly gone, to the point that even Julke and his command staff realized it as well, ordering the remaining 3 line corps to halt their advance on the second line and begin a slow and steady approach. The trenches that the Death Korps had so recently left would now have to be redug. Atlas excavators would have to create new firing positions for artillery, and the second line would be approached over the course of the coming weeks and months with heavy preparatory bombardments and the constructions of yet further offensive and defensive trench lines. Despite all of the ground ostensibly captured by the Death Korps, they were essentially right back where they started, occupying extensive trench lines facing off against massed enemy defenses that could only be reduced by heavy and continuous artillery fire along with non-stop assaults. It was becoming painfully obvious to everyone involved that the war on Vraks was going to be a lengthy affair indeed. And the end, which was ever so briefly in sight, turned out to be nothing but a cruel mirage. And with that, we will wrap up this entry into the Siege of Vraks. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider sharing it around to friends and other interested parties, and until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much so for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.